Anna, thank you so much for joining us on the Hurt Healing podcast. It's a real joy to see you here today.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you. And nice to explore. I walked all the way through London to get here. So it's really nice. It's like I'm fresh off a walk.
Feeling fresh. So what inspired you to write the Good Decision Diary, and what need did you hope that it would meet?
Okay. So do you know, I knew I was writing another book and I hadn't quite pinned down what it was going to be. And I knew it was going to have like a journal element to it. And kind of it's going around my mind as to what we would cover. And I was standing in the shower. So I was having a shower, probably a rushed one, knowing me. I don't spend long in the shower. Not like my husband, he could spend forever in there. And I just remember looking down at my body and thinking, just having this moment of like appreciation, but also thinking I've been so mean to you. And I've also been so good to you. And I've tended a lot of my life to kind of really swing between the two. And I think I'd gone through a bit of a time maybe of, I don't know, a little bit of self-sabotage. And I thought, starting from Monday, I'm going to start making better decisions and I'm going to look after myself and I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to have more water. I'm going to do. And I just thought, that is how I've always done it. Is like these kind of catapulting myself from that place of like shame and self-criticism, using that as like a launch pad to make all these promises and like setting the bar really high and being really black and white about it. And I just thought I need to do it differently. That's just not a sustainable way to nurture myself or grow. And I thought I just made a pledge to myself. I'm going to try and make better decisions more of the time. Because I knew that come Tuesday, I would probably have been hormonal and like totally no impulse control. And I would have like ended up just breaking all my own rules. And I thought, no, I want to really take into account my humanness and why I self-sabotage and how can I make more gentle decisions. So it was just trying to be a bit more gentle about it and gentle on myself. And I thought this is what I'd love to write about, is how we can be so black and white and how we make these promises that come out of a good place but often use the launch pad of like shame to make change, and how can we just be more gentle about growth. And understand self-sabotage and why we walk straight into decisions that we know we don't want to make. That's what led to it, and just to take people on that journey with me and being a bit more gentle.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it's something I really relate to. I think as we get older, we do tend to want to actually start nurturing and looking after ourselves more. I think when you're in your 20s and early 30s, you sort of have this view that your body's just this object that you can abuse to serve your mind. And I think actually really reconnecting with that, and as you said, like looking at your body and being like, wow, this body has been a vessel that's really served me, and regardless of the abuse that I might have inflicted on it still continues to work in its way. And actually that's almost just like marveling at that and just seeing it as, this is something that I want for life, and if I want it to serve me for life, I've got to actually start taking the steps to really nurture it and to stop like self-flagellating and to stop going down that route constantly of self-sabotage.
Yeah, absolutely. But it can, I think we tend to do what we've always done. We take the approach we've always taken, unless we decide that actually we're going to try and work hard to find a different path. And it's not easy to do that. Like it takes very intentional decisions. So I think it's just noticing where those decisions are and just thinking, at this decision point, I could either make a decision that kind of nurtures myself or doesn't. Yeah. And just seeing it as, sometimes being a little bit clearer.
Yeah, because that's a distinction you often draw between is the nurturing and the self-sabotage and how we navigate that fine line. Because it is so easy if your default option is to self-sabotage, because sometimes that actually ironically feels more comfortable than the nurturing, because we're actually really not taught to nurture ourselves, because we're always fed this myth of like, being women, we've got to be smaller, we've got to look a certain way, we've got to fit a certain criteria to be attractive, we've got to reach all these benchmarks in life. And in fact, if it comes from within and you do nurture yourself, it's amazing what starts to happen. You just exude a different energy, I think.
Yeah, and so much I think of the internal dialogue that just kind of often derails the good decisions that we'd quite like to make, or just that sense of maybe low self-worth or confidence that ultimately perhaps we don't really feel deserving of the good things that can come from making good decisions and finding a different path. So it's recognizing that all these different things kind of feed in to the decisions that we choose to make. So I think sometimes just kind of putting ourselves on this tightrope of like making right decisions all the time, it just doesn't take into account the complexity of who we are and the stories and the narratives and the traumas that perhaps we've been through, and where our self-esteem and our capacity are. And there's just so much more at play that if we're going to either shame or guilt ourselves for having an extra cup of coffee, or isolating ourselves when we're having a hard time again, even though we know we want to be more open with people, then actually we're overlooking so much of the story.
No, and I think that's another thing, is that we are the stories we tell ourselves. And I think so often we live in the past, and there's that sort of past imposter syndrome where we're actually almost in the mindset of how we were 10 years ago. And actually it's reflecting on that and being like, actually, no, I'm not the person I was 10 years ago. And it's okay to have a night in by myself if I'm feeling like I just need to be a bit of a hermit for a while. But I know that this won't last for weeks and weeks and weeks, which it might have done 5 years ago. And I think as we get to know ourselves better, and I think, so often people say, oh, well, it's such a joy getting older because you feel just more self-confident and you feel that sense of liberation and being able to be yourself and learning who you are and what makes you tick. And I think sometimes knowing that actually you can get yourselves out of those ruts sort of much quicker is something that's very reassuring.
Yeah, and finding those tools and what they are for you, and knowing yourself well enough to know, I track my cycles, for example, and I started realizing, that around my period there were certain habits good habits that I felt so much harder to keep. I mean, whether it's about how much coffee I drink or how I move my body or whatever those things are, I notice how much harder it is to make a decision. So instead of just completely kind of bracing myself and shaming myself, it's like, just cut myself some slack. If I'm not hurting myself or anybody else, if I end up making a decision that is probably slightly less than nurturing, in the grand scheme of stuff, it's okay. And just accounting for that and recognizing that. And I think especially if you're like a type A kind of perfectionist person who likes to feel like you've got quite a grip on control, it's just thinking, how can I just loosen the reins a little bit on myself? I'm not a machine. I'm not always going to be getting it right. And that's just, it's not failure. It's just kind of recognizing my humanness and not seeing
Completely.
that as something that needs fixing all the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I recently went on a retreat, and something that really came out of it for me was it's fine to be disciplined and motivated, but you've also got to tap into what your body wants and needs at a particular time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you've completely fallen off the wagon. If you say one day you actually really don't feel like moving your body, and you're feeling hormonal, and actually recognizing that and owning that, because that's actually nurturing and looking after yourself. I think sometimes the white knuckling and the pushing through and the sort of absolutely I've got to do this come hell or high water, that's when things start to go wrong.
Yeah, and you can lead to burnout, which is an incredibly humbling experience. And it tends to be when you have pushed beyond the limits of your own resources and you've overlooked your humanness and the expectations that you've placed upon yourself, haven't listened to those little warning signs. And when we think about serious athletes, they factor in rest and recovery. It is vitally important. Yet why do we tend to just force ourselves to keep going and going and going and going? And it tends to be because our sense of self-worth is tied up in productivity or output. And actually it's adding rest and recovery, and the fact that one day, I like to get up, do a workout before the kids get up. This morning I knew I was going to be walking, and I thought, you know what, I haven't slept great, I'm not going to do it. And I just really gave myself permission. So that inner perfectionist in me was just actually that feels like a bit of a relief to be giving yourself permission. But another day that might be kind of self-sabotage. So it's as we start to know ourselves and trust that on the whole, we like to move towards growth. We, on the whole, how I move my body is really good. And actually it has to account for all of the other days and all of the other feelings and different resources.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just going to constantly feel like we're failing.
Yeah, it's true. And actually it's, James Clear would say that one day missed is just a mistake and 2 days missed is the formation of a new habit, which, is interesting because it's actually giving ourselves, as you said, that slack and actually tapping into what we need at a particular time. And for me, that's freedom.
Yes. 100%.
I think it's that. So when you're on an absolute mission, which I know you've been in the past and I have as well, of having to do all these things because you feel like you have to tick all the boxes every day, regardless of how you feel, and bypassing all those bodily signs and signals, and just actually being able, it's how amazing this morning that you're able to just say, you know what, actually no, it's not the right day, and that's okay. For me, that's a signal that one's more in control of one's mind than just like sort of bypassing that bodily signal that says, no, please don't push me today.
Yeah, and listening to yourself and bringing another part of the conversation that may not have been there for a long time, you know, even because that other voice that wanted to hold on to a routine or certain rules, you know, that would have won out. And at points there wouldn't have even been another kind of more gentle coaching. And it's a coaching voice. It's like a firm voice. It's like, no, Anna, you're not going to do that today. You don't need to do that today. And it's like, okay. And respecting and trusting that not everything is just going to fall apart because you don't stick to your own rules. And I think we can learn to trust. And I think that's where the freedom can be found, and just leaning into your humanness and listening in.
No, you're so right. And I do think it's, as you start to tap into that instinct more and more, it's amazing how it grows. And then you start to sort of really trust it. And it's but if you bypass it all the time, it just doesn't exist. It's just a quiet, like tiny little voice. It's like, no, but whatever, I'm going to ignore you.
Yeah. And I think recognizing different layers and levels of energy that you have as well. I think sometimes we think, you know, we've got movement and that's kind of it. That's the only real output. But emotional energy spent is physical energy. And I remember doing a live TV thing not long ago, and I had my Garmin watch on because I love, still saying that I'm walking. I love a bit of biodata, and I found it so helpful. And I looked at my watch, right, and it said that because I was so full of adrenaline and stress, I burnt the same amount of energy as I would in like 2 high intensity workouts. And it was such a visual picture to me to remind myself that emotional stress, kind of cognitive focus, it is physiologically draining. And I think just to start taking into account and respecting that we are outputting far much more energy, I think, day to day than we realize that we'll ever see on an Apple Watch, you know. And it's just respecting that and thinking, how can I honor my body's need for rest and slowness, and what might that look like, and how can I both kind of stretch myself and nurture myself in the decisions that I make.
Yeah, no, I completely
I found that
agree.
so helpful.
So how would you like people to approach the book? Because you chose quite a specific structure, which I'd love you to tell our listeners about.
Yeah. So it starts off, so the first part is kind of this kind of quite poetic, self-reflective part. And I'm just talking about growth, and I'm talking about, there's a lot of metaphors. So I love a metaphor. So one of my favorite metaphors in there that I had in mind was, you know, a tree. Beautiful big old tree, and we look at the tree and we think, wow, that tree is so big and it's strong. And what we don't see always, so I've been on some beautiful walks recently where the root system is completely exposed. It's amazing. And what you see in a root system is that, you know, the roots are kind of growing, then they might hit a rock, some of them might stop growing, some of them might go around the rock, some of them might kind of, you know, displace the rock. And there's all of these complex root systems that I like to think are kind of the decisions that we make. You know, sometimes we make a decision and it just comes to a halt, and then sometimes we reroute, and it's all of these kind of these, what we might see as failings or what we might see as kind of false starts, they all add to the strength of that tree. They all work to kind of create that growth in some way or another. And I think, you know, we are the sum of every decision that we have ever made. And I think sometimes we look on some as real kind of failings, or we wish we could have done stuff differently. We find it hard to find compassion for ourselves. But ultimately, the learnings, the brokenness, the times we've been humbled, the times, they've all come from this complex network of roots to create who we are. Someone that is loved by people that really know us well, and someone that, just has story and value to bring to the world. And it's just kind of an invitation, I think, to just be kinder to how we understand where we've come from, and also where we set the path to where we want to go. So the first part is really kind of poetic and just talking in that way. And then the second part is kind of inviting a bit of the reader's voice into it. So kind of asking some questions and getting you to think about stuff. And then the third part is really just kind of quite journal style. So I give, you know, lots of different kind of thoughts, and then invite people to go through something that might have happened that day and that they might feel guilty or not happy about, and just kind of reframing it and recognizing that guilt, it's not there to shame us, it's not there to point the finger at us, it's just there as a little flag that pops up and says, this needs some attention, whether it's just to let it go and think, actually that was not my fault, or I didn't know better then, and just if it's there to prompt us, not shame us, what's it prompting us to do? So it might be to apologize, or it might be to apologize to ourselves, or it might be to try and think, what boundary can I put in so I can maybe make a different decision next time? So yeah, it's just quite, kind of really get your teeth into it all.
No, and it's really useful because I think those books where that you've taken the reader on a journey and then there's a piece of self-reflection at the end, it's actually, I found it immensely helpful, and I related to so much of what you had written about in the first part. And actually then putting it into practice then makes you really consolidate it, because it's very easy to read these books and then you forget. I mean, I just literally forgotten like the majority of it. Yeah, within like 2 days. It's like, oh God, did I read that book? What was it called? But once you've actually consciously had to write things down, really think about them. And I loved your analogy of the tree as well. And I just thought it was so apt. And you're right, you can have these beautiful, huge trees and parts of them can be dying and they're not perfect. And yet they've stood the test of time. And someone asked me the other day if I could be a plant, what would I be? And I said I would be an oak tree, because I think they're so just masterful in the way that they've, not only have they sort of stood the test of time and must have witnessed so much. And people go to trees for all sorts of things. They sort of, people propose under trees, they cry under trees, they read, they seek shade under them, they seek like shelter when it's sort of raining. Like they're extraordinary things, but they're not all perfect.
Oh yeah.
So it's that sort of, it's a very beautiful analogy. So yeah, no, I really like that. You do write very beautifully about shame as a driver for change. And why was shifting away from shame such a turning point for you? And when would you say that happened?
Oh my gosh, I think it's been different points along the way. I've always carried a lot of shame in feeling like things are my fault somehow. If something isn't right with one of my children, or if they're struggling, it's my failure. I should have known more. I should have done things differently. Or if, in the workplace, something hasn't gone to plan, it's because so it's always this kind of like turning back on myself. And I think one of the ways that I really like to understand shame is, I think guilt says, I could have done differently. That's kind of just, it's quite diplomatic, right? I could have done something differently. And shame says, I'm the failure. And it's really kind of, these are really powerful statements, I think, that we make about ourselves. And I think understanding why I carry so much shame has been really interesting. So I went through a lot of trauma as a child. My sister died of a brain tumor when I was 10. And I think my response to that, my coping mechanism, my survival mechanism, was to be kind of neat and quiet and kind of try and like not add to any of the sadness. So I internalized a lot. If there was trouble with friends at school, I wouldn't want to kind of add any drama to anything. So that was very much a survival mechanism. It just became my way. It just became how I interacted with the world and how I formed my relationships. So they all I was the person that everyone came to. I was like, I'm fine, let's talk about you. Like that was very much the role that I played. And I think it was just getting to that place where it just became too much and it's just not sustainable, and you end up having little to no boundaries and like not seeking or accepting support when you need it. So I think that cycle of shame, I never really gave myself an opportunity to think that perhaps not everything was down to me and not everything was my fault, and any failing in relationship wasn't always, me. But I kind of learned that in different ways over the years. And now just I'm so much more accepting of my humanness, my vulnerability, and so much more open about that, and recognize it as part of my story and my humanness rather than something to be hidden. And a failing, really, that if I'm not strong and productive and supportive all the time, then I'm not enough.
No, there's that feeling of, not being not enough, being undeserving, all those emotions that kind of go alongside shame, which can be just so, wearing and toxic for one's self-confidence. And then you show up as a very different person in the world. And I think that's definitely something I've noticed, is that like there's an energy you exude that changes when you step out of that shame, because people are very receptive to what's going on internally, even though they might not know. And I think when you are living in that cloud of shame, you're just quite withdrawn. You don't attract that sort of abundance, and therefore you're kind of almost perpetuating the story in your head.
So true. Yeah, definitely. And I think there comes a point where you feel like actually that is the role that you play in relationships is the only reason that you have those relationships. Like I felt even that my husband, if he really knew me, wouldn't want to have married me, or that if my friends really knew what I thought or felt sometimes, or how resentful I was at them for the fact that I had no boundaries, then they wouldn't want to be my friends anymore. So to challenge shame and low self-esteem is really just to take massive risks on all your relationships and be like, if I'm more myself, will you still be there?
Yeah.
And I think when you start showing more of yourself and you start allowing yourself to kind of accept more of those parts of yourself, you start doing relationships differently, and allowing yourself to lean on people as maybe historically you've only really felt comfortable in that other role. And it just, relationships change, boundaries change, and life changes as a result.
Yeah, and I think it becomes much easier to set boundaries, because suddenly people see you showing up as a bit more of a sort of an assertive version of yourself, and they're like, okay, wow. I think when you're constantly in that cycle of shame, people do sort of bulldoze over you more, and they think that they can treat you in a certain way. And suddenly when you say, actually, the way you spoke to me really hurt me, and I just want to pick up on that. Like, why did you say that, and what did you mean by that? And I've started doing it slowly with a few friends and experimenting, and it is some people react, and that's initially like, whoa, well, like, they get all defensive. But actually then the right people tend to be like, actually, you're right, like, I didn't mean it in that way, and maybe I did sound overly aggressive, and I was in a really bad mood, so I'm really sorry about that. And of course you don't always get that response, because not everyone is going to give it to you,
but if you don't get that response, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't have said that thing. Or I think it's just showing up more in your relationships as yourself, and holding those boundaries that are actually about protecting. So the way I think about it is like it's me as well, like not just me first. Because I think sometimes if you've kind of lived in the opposite stance of kind of making yourself small and neat for people, and maybe just internalizing a lot of the hurt to kind of protect other people from either themselves or some of those emotions that you carry, when you do start speaking those things out and testing it out, it just shows you that maybe the right people, can still be there. And I think I used to fear that showing my vulnerability would just push everyone away. But actually what I found is that the opposite is true, that your relationships deepen and they feel richer, and there is less of that, if you only knew what I was really like, because actually they do, and they're still there.
How did your husband, how did that relationship evolve over time?
Well, so we've been together since 2004. So we've been together quite like 21 years now. So we've done a lot of growing up together. And I think it was a real adjustment, when you start off being that person that will be any version of you, to secure, it's kind of like, it's a safety mechanism, right? So then, just finding my voice a little bit more, and him seeing me change. There were points, I remember one day being at the beach with my kids, and it started raining, and we just everyone was just rushing off the beach. It was really raining, just gathering everything and hiding for cover. And I remember the kids wouldn't get out of the sea, so I just literally just threw off like pretty much all my clothes, kept my underwear on, and ran in the sea with them. And it was so liberating. And it was so funny because I came out and he was like, "You don't do stuff like that." And I was like, well, maybe I do now. And it's just being open to the fact that you're going to change along the way, and there will be different versions of you as you start placing boundaries and you start using your voice, and we can do it warmly and kindly. We can do it thoughtfully and wisely, and gently, but just showing up and being open to the fact that you're both going to change along the way.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I think that's the sign of a beautiful relationship, is someone who allows you to grow, and you grow alongside one another.
Yeah, and I think sometimes there's growth spurts, that sometimes maybe one person grows in a, like, oh, okay, like we're recalibrating now. But I think it's just openness is so important, because it's it's clumsy along the way. You know, when you start setting boundaries and maybe that no comes out a little bit sharp, or it comes out and you're so defensive because you're expecting to have to fight for yourself when actually you don't need to do that anymore. And, you know, it is clumsy. And sometimes we swing, you know, there have been times when I've got so excited about holding boundaries, I'm like doing it left, right, and center, where actually sometimes I could have done with being a little bit more flexible. But we're just learning all the time.
Yeah.
So it's having grace for yourself and each other as you try and, just try new things.
What do you say to people who think that, oh my God, if I start tapping into that instinct and if I start being myself, I'm just going to lose all motivation and I'm not going to do anything? Because I think there's this Judith Joseph, she talks about high functioning depression. And it's these people who feel like if they keep going, so things will be okay. Whereas if they stop, suddenly everything will just implode and they'll lose all motivation.
Yeah. And sometimes, you know, and I think as a therapist, I see that happening. I see people just completely coming to a point where they're like, this isn't sustainable anymore. I don't even know, you know, one of the questions I might ask a client might be, you know, tell me 3 things you need. And it might be, that's when the point comes where they think, actually, I don't even know what I need anymore. You know, I've plowned through for so long that I've completely lost connection with myself. And I think it can be disruptive. Holding new boundaries can disrupt relationships. And I think, you know, we don't often talk about that enough, is that there are sometimes relationships that cannot exist because that other person might not be able to respect the boundary that you're holding. So it is messy. It can be really messy. It can, of course, you know, be quite slow and gentle, but sometimes it is messy and it's clumsy and it just feels like everything is up in the air. But I would say that, you know, find those people, 2 or 3 people in your life who have historically been kind and supportive, and hold on to them and be open with them so that you can find those anchors whilst everything else is kind of shifting around. And out the other side, you know, when you've got more confidence in holding healthy boundaries, you know, life will look different. It will feel more sustainable. There'll be more gentleness in it. We can still succeed and we can still be driven without doing it through kind of beating ourselves up. And we can still do great things without an inner bully as well.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. How do you think we stop, though, guilt and shame becoming so entangled and toxic, and just how do we stop that cycle and say, okay, right, I might be feeling shame today, I might be feeling guilty, but it stops now?
Yeah. So I developed a little 3-step technique, which is in the book, called ACT, and I use it for all kinds of guilt and shame. So what happens is, you know, guilt is that little feeling that says I have done something, or I think I've done something that is outside of my values somehow. And if we don't address it, that's when it starts kind of veering into shame. So shame is often just guilt that is just left and it's layered upon layer, and we start, you know, it often starts feeling like it's confirming narratives about the fact we're not good enough, and it's just become so powerful. So the 3-step technique is called Address Compassion Tweak. So it's ACT. So you get the thing that you feel guilty about. I'm just trying to think what it might be. Let's just say I've been run down and I haven't I've missed a deadline for work, right? And I feel really guilty. I feel really shamed. It's tapping into the imposter syndrome of everyone's just going to think I'm rubbish and they're going to find me out, and everyone's just waiting for a chance to kind of fire me. So address it, name it. You know, I feel guilty for missing a deadline. Okay, named it. C is compassion, because when we start injecting compassion into guilt, like, shame just can't exist. Shame cannot exist where compassion is. And Brene Brown says that, and I love her. So how can you bring some compassion into that? You know, it might be, and this is a good way to think, is what would I say to a friend? So it might be, I'm being run down. I've been under-resourced. You know, to expect myself to carry on as I normally would to the level that I normally do is actually quite a tall order, and I probably should have taken that into account. It might be, you know, on the whole, I tend to be really good at deadlines. So actually this is just a random one, and then, you know, people aren't going to come shouting at me. So just kind of bring a little bit of compassion and humanness into it all. And then T, so I'd say if guilt is there to prompt you, not shame you, what is it prompting you to do? What's the tweak that you can do off the back of it? Probably have a conversation with someone at work and say, you know, I'm really sorry, I've been quite run down and I should have communicated that. It was too big a project to do in this time frame. I'm really under resourced. And then just think, okay, so moving forward, I want to be more honest about my capacity at work. You know, if there's something going on behind the scenes that's really jeopardizing a deadline, I'm going to try and be a bit more honest with myself and others. So once you've done that, the guilt's just served its purpose. Like, you've addressed it. And sometimes we need to go over it again and kind of re-emphasize it to ourselves, because old habits and narratives die quite hard. But I think that can be a really proactive, like helpful tool, just to bring some clarity, to let the guilt serve its purpose, and then to be able to move on.
Yeah, no, it's very, very good advice. So act.
Yeah.
And all or nothing thinking is, I think, something that I certainly really struggle with. And you talk about sort of sitting in the grey.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
So hard. I think, again, it's just bringing that humanness into it. I think we love, especially some of us love the kind of the feeling of clarity and confidence that comes in the black or the white. You know, it's like, right, I've got a plan, and we can feel really motivated by that. We can feel really anchored and grounded. We can feel quite safe in that. But it's thinking, okay, what is that plan, and how feasible is it? Have I taken my humanness into account? Have I taken the fact that there are so many other things that are draining, you know, that are using my time and my energy and my focus? Just making sure that you are planning this as you as a human, rather than in the ideal perfect scenario where you were completely resourced and had all the support and all the time. So making sure that it's realistic is a good place to start.
I know, it's just so easy, isn't it, when you're a perfectionist as well? It's sort of being addicted to those dopamine highs, and it's like, well, if I can't do it like to this degree, then what's the point of doing it at all? And it's that thing of like, if I can't go to the gym for 2 hours, then what's the point in going at all? If I can't eat like the whole bar of chocolate, then like one square, that seems really boring.
Yeah. And it's just starting to notice that little voice that comes up inside when you're like, what's the point? I'm just thinking something is always better than nothing. Like, one step towards that is always better than, you know, not moving at all. And just little by little, you know, thinking what is feasible today? Where do I need to push myself? Where do I actually need to just pull back and cut myself some slack? And the hard thing about it is that there isn't a roadmap for all of this. Like, it looks different for different people on different days. And it requires us to have that self-respect, to think, I'm going to listen to myself and ask myself those questions. And it's not one size fits all. And we like a plan.
Yeah, no, we do like a plan, and we like structure, and we do like routine to a degree, even though some people sort of shy away from it. I think fundamentally humans do thrive on having a bit of routine.
Absolutely.
And a loose structure. But it is. I mean, and then it's the sort of risk of falling into self-sabotage when things don't go to that sort of all extreme.
Yeah.
And you sort of go into that like, well, because I've done X, Y, and Z now, I might as well press the fuck button.
Yeah, and it all just falls apart.
Out.
Just go absolutely wild.
Yeah, so how do we stop self-sabotaging?
Again, catching ourselves, thinking, you know, when we're at that point where we know that we want to make a decision that is not serving us. I think sometimes self-sabotage comes from the fact that we feel deserving of punishment, you know, that we feel actually it feels unfamiliar to make decisions that are good. It feels unfamiliar to rest. It feels unfamiliar to do those things that we need as humans. So actually it feels so much more familiar to feed that narrative of like, I'm not deserving of good things. I don't stick to stuff. I'm never going to keep this up anyway. And I think actually if we start listening to that little inner voice in a different way, it's going to be less likely to act out, right? So if my kids are playing up, you know, if I was to actually listen to what they were trying to say, listen to the need behind it or the feeling behind it, whatever bit of behavior that's going to drive me at the wall is probably less likely to happen because they felt heard. And I think sometimes that's happening in us, is that, you know, maybe underneath it all, it's too much. Maybe underneath it all, we're lacking support. Maybe we don't have accountability. Maybe we feel a bit unseen in this, you know, area that we're trying to grow in. Maybe there's stuff that isn't being said and acknowledged. So, you know, that kind of need it gets kind of just pressurized and it just comes out sideways in certain behaviors that are like the tantrum, you know, that we're just like, sod it. I'm going to do the thing because actually we haven't heard the need. So
yeah, and I think
parenting.
as you tap into the need more, and I think again that goes to reconnecting with yourself and actually wanting to nurture yourself, the self-sabotage starts to wane a bit. And I
Yeah.
think if you had told me even like 5 years ago, okay, you know, you're going to just actually lose the desire to self-sabotage, I'd be like, yeah, right, you know, it's just part of my psyche, it's just what I do.
Yeah.
But actually, as you stop going to that all or nothing and those extremes, I think it's very linked.
Yeah.
I think then you want to self-sabotage less because you start wanting to just live on just a bit more of an even keel, and moderation is just a bit more appealing. You don't want to do those things that make you feel really shit. You just don't want to go to those extreme highs and those extreme lows anymore.
Yeah, and it takes knowing yourself, it takes trusting yourself. You know, it takes being kind to yourself.
Yeah.
And I think we really, really that's so hard to do when you're bullying yourself from the inside.
Yeah, and I think people fear moderation and being normal and sort of being ordinary. And actually, like, that's sometimes where the joy in life comes, because particularly with things like eating disorders, where you are often going to extremes, I think it's realizing that actually, like, life can be way more exciting when actually the food is just kind of a bit more, you know, regulated and normal.
And I think it's finding safety in that. It's believing that actually, you know, if you've grown up in chaos, whether it is, you know, around you or inside you, you know, that is your home. That is what makes you. That's what you're used to. So actually, you know, to feel like you're sitting in the grey, to feel like maybe it's a bit more boring and mundane, and like that feels unsafe until it feels safe. It feels unsafe until it feels familiar. You know, for years, I couldn't sit down without feeling guilty. You know, I'd catapult off the sofa like if someone came in, you know, because I wouldn't want to be seen as unproductive. And actually to rest, to slow down, also felt quite unsafe and unfamiliar to me. You know, I'd be battling with like, well, what good am I doing? I should be doing this, I should be doing that, because it's a challenge of identity. I believed I was only really worthy of anything good in life if I was productive and helpful. So I think it's kind of starting to seek familiarity in those safer spaces, in the greys, in the bit where you're bored, in the bit where things are slower, in the bit where life is just kind of bumbling along, and it's going to feel unsafe until it starts feeling safe. And then you realize actually it's better here.
Yeah,
but that takes time.
It does take time, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes constant practice. But again, something that you say about community being essential, I think is really important, because I do think having that accountability and the people around you who are going to support you on that journey is really important. And I think over time, certainly something that I found is that actually is finding your tribe. And it's like not necessarily those old friends who you sort of felt like almost obligated to still be connected to. It's actually as you step into a slightly newer version of yourself and you start to get to know yourself better, you do start to attract maybe slightly different people and start to just like reevaluate certain friends' values and see that maybe they're not the best people for me anymore. And actually and that's the beauty of life. I think you move through different stages with people. And also, like, for me, I love having friends who are older and younger, because I find that you just teach, you know, they teach you so much.
Yeah, I think that's it. And one of my favorite little phrases that I say to myself at the moment, because I think part of addressing this is being okay with being misunderstood. Because especially if you've been someone that for so many years has kind of lived in a way that you have maybe changed or challenged how you are and who you are because of fear of what other people think, and the fear of being misunderstood, which can feel really threatening. You know, you can feel really other, you can feel really alone if you don't feel understood by the people around you. And I think, you know, what you're saying about finding those people is just feeling known and feeling like you don't have to caveat. So my little phrase that I'm using a lot at the minute is like, if you know, you know. And I think, you know, there are times when we feel misunderstood, and often it's that discomfort between the gap of our own experience and someone else's ability to understand it. And really that's just differing experience, right? But we can read so much into the gap that our experience is invalid, that someone doesn't take us seriously, or they don't see the pain, or the, you know, whatever it might be. And I think finding those people in whatever nuance of life, whether it's struggling with addiction and or parenting in a certain like iteration parenting. I have an autistic child, so that brings kind of certain challenges, and just having people who you don't have to explain the backstory, you don't have to explain medical models or whatever it may be, you just feel known by them is so affirming, and it takes a lot of the weight and the shame out of feeling misunderstood by other people in your life who maybe just don't get it because they just haven't lived it. And it's not a criticism of you, it's just a difference. So those people that know, I think it's really great to have.
Exactly. And it's just the unspoken knowing, which is sometimes so refreshing, and being able to ask for help, which I think a lot of us really struggle with. And when you really do need that help and support, just saying, actually, I am really struggling, and it would be really helpful if you just came over for an hour.
Yeah.
Or you just like went to the shop for me if it's offered. Because I think so often we shut people down.
Yeah.
Would you like me to do anything? Oh, no, don't worry, it's fine.
Don't
Because
worry,
we feel like a burden. And actually, sometimes it's really nice to know that people are there and they can do things for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what community looks like. And I think especially if you've been someone that is very self-sufficient, you know, I was very much always like, don't worry, I'll sort myself out. And I think that's even part of the reason I became a therapist, because it even more legitimized that dynamic. It's like, I'm not only the helper in relationships and friends, I'm now like, that is my actual job too. So it kind of felt quite a safe thing to do. But I think one of the most important things is to let people in, and it can feel a bit like, what's the point, what's the good in someone knowing? Like, they can't change anything, they can't do anything, but actually, you know, we're not standing alone in it. Like, we've got someone beside us, and there's like co-regulation that happens with like nervous systems and like mirror neurons. Is that actually just having someone who knows, who is standing beside us, like metaphorically or physically? Like, there is so much power that meets such a deep human need to feel seen. So they might not be able to do anything, but they can be someone. And that, you know, I think if you walk through the fire alone and you walk through the fire of life circumstances with someone else who sees you and gets you and is there, you'll know that there is a vast difference, and the circumstances might not change, but you are not alone. And that, you know, it's so powerful.
Yeah. And again, it's that temptation to isolate when you're not feeling great. It's just, again, it perpetuates that feeling of no one likes me, no one cares. And you actually do have to put yourself out there sometimes.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you have to go to like a sort of a rave, but it's just, you know, going wherever it is, to a local cafe or to the gym, where you just have some interaction. It doesn't even need to be with your best friends. Like, that's what I found. Just having like a little community that you can tap into.
Yeah.
And the conversation doesn't have to be really deep and meaningful either. But I know that I define myself from when I have sort of hours, you know, even an afternoon all alone without having any sort of interaction with a person in person. It's I feel a bit weird. I sort of start to feel a bit like, oh my gosh, this is just not really normal.
It's your own voice, isn't it? Then it's just your own voice, and it isn't kind of interjected by other thoughts and opinions and like tones. And I think, yeah, we need community, and it's great to be happy with being on your own, but there's a point. It's knowing when solitude, which can be quite like refilling and like quite grounding, can tip into isolation, which is kind of that more, actually, I'm going into that space now where I could really do with being around someone and just nudging yourself. And again, it's those decision points of, I know what I want to do, I just want to shut the world out, but I know what I need to do. And sometimes those things can look quite different. And it's just, trying to lean into a little bit more into what those needs are rather than those kind of ever-changing wants.
No, completely. In part 2 of the book, you write about observation and defining values. Why does that step matter so much in lasting change?
I think knowing what those values are, and I think often we have a sense of what they are because we know what it feels like when a boundary is crossed, or we know what we feel like. You know, one of my values might be that I want to be quite intentional about my time when I'm working so that I can be more present with the kids and just available. So then if I'm like replying to emails whilst cooking dinner and like they're shouting at me and I'm like not listening and I'm getting annoyed, and, you know, I feel like, I feel that guilt rise up, and it could easily slip into shame, being like, Anna, you're rubbish, like you're a rubbish parent and all of this. But actually, I think it's that feeling in your gut when you know that something is happening or you're making a decision that is just not aligned with the value that you have. So I think sometimes it's good to do this exercise of thinking, what are my values around relationships, around work, around, you know, different areas of my life, and just writing them down and seeing what they are, because we already know deep down. And it's, I think the more clarity we have, and we're kind of allowing ourselves to kind of externally process things like this and write them down, then the more conscious we can be about the decisions that we're making, or at least, just become a little bit more aware.
No, completely. When someone feels totally stuck, what's one small step that they could take today to make a little bit of a better decision?
So I think it is thinking, how are you feeling stuck, and what is the smallest step that you can take? Because I think when we feel really stuck, we can get into that kind of freeze state. We talk about fight, flight, but there's that freeze state of like everything just feels too much, and I'm frozen. I don't know what to do. So I think sometimes, it's so tempting at these points to think, right, I'm gonna make this big plan. I need to do all of this stuff, and actually, that just then feels like a mountain that we don't have capacity to climb. So it's like, what is the smallest thing that you can do for yourself, that feels so almost like insignificant? Because then that gives us, if we're able to do that, it might be, someone that hasn't been outside for a while, and it just, it's started to become a thing, it starts to become a thing that actually you start feeling anxious about, and it just feels really habitual, and then it just feels massive. And it might be, they think, right, I'm going to make sure I get out every day. Next week, I'm going to go see someone, I'm going to go do something. But actually that, that's a mountain to climb. So what might it be like just to stand on the doorstep for 2 minutes whilst you brush your teeth? What might that feel like? And if that feels too much, just open the door and stand on the doorstep, like 3 deep breaths, and then shut the door and come back in. And that feeling of kind of accomplishment, even on the small scale, it's really motivating, and it starts kind of giving us a little bit of confidence or a taste for more. Or so it's just, if you're feeling frozen, just be gentle. What might that small thing be that you can start? And don't look too far down the line and create this kind of plan of how you're going to go from there to there. Just start with that today.
Yeah, and don't fall into that trap of thinking, oh god, well, it's so small, what's the point, so I won't do it at all. Because it's like habit stacking, and actually eventually that minute on the step will turn into 3 minutes, will turn into 5 minutes, will eventually maybe be a walk down the street, will then be, you just, it is. And that's something I've definitely experienced. It's baby steps, and it is habit stacking.
Yeah, and it's trusting that baby steps get you somewhere.
They do. They're moving you forward. And as you said at the beginning, as long as we're moving forward and progressing in life, there's an immense amount of satisfaction that comes with that.
Yeah, and I love, oh gosh, I'm going to have to look at the reference, but it says, basically it's saying, if you really think that little things don't make a difference, then you've never seen like a match start a wildfire. Like literally these little things, they can feel so insignificant, but in time they build self-trust, they build a sense of pride and accomplishment and momentum, and they just open another little door each time.
So at the end of the book, you finish with some reflections, and which are sort of then asked questions and mantras. Which 2 stand out most to you right now?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember now. If you got any prompts. The thing is, my head is also in my next book, so this is what happens. You end up writing a book whilst publishing another book, so my head is in rage.
Your head is in rage.
And decision making.
We don't have to. No, we don't have to. We can just scrap that question. So what would you like to leave a listener with as one piece of advice today?
I think and I say this to parents, and it just drives people a little bit wild before I explain myself, right? And I say, sometimes imagine that you have a child with you all the time, just that little version of you when you're 6, you when you're 7, whatever it is, it's this little you. And everything you do to yourself, you also do to her. Like, she is there. And when she might be saying, I'm really thirsty, and you're like, oh, for goodness sake, shut up. She might be saying, I'm tired, I need a break. And you're like, oh, no, not now. And it's like actually thinking, take into account that little version of you who is always there, that vulnerable, needy, child that needs to feel heard. Otherwise, those things start coming out in meltdowns and tantrums. And we know what that feels like. So just imagine that you have young you beside you, because I think sometimes it's so much easier to introduce compassion and kindness when we imagine that part of us is kind of young and present. So I think that can be really helpful when considering how we might make some more nurturing decisions.
And where would you like to be in 5 years' time if you were to be able to reflect now?
Oh my gosh, 5 years' time. I just never have much of a life plan, so I don't really think ahead that far. So I think I'll be 45. I'll have done like half my 40s, as I'm 40 soon. I think I would just like to continue growing in confidence and gentleness. I don't know what that will look like. Maybe I'll still be writing. Maybe I'll be more restful. I think more restful. I'm trying to embrace rest more and feel safer in that restful state. So a bit more rested. Continuing kind of being confident and gentle on myself and seeing how that impacts my relationships. Yeah.
Anna, you've been fantastic, and it's been a really, really lovely, interesting conversation. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all.
It's been a privilege.